a 72-hour order to defy anyone. I signed it so that my people would know we still have the right to decide for ourselves.
At first light, a message arrived from Washington. It wasn't a conversation. It was a demand. 60% of Burkina Faso's gold and oil, or lose access to the dollar. No meetings, no appeals, just 48 hours. By nightfall, Captain Ibrahim Traore signed his response, a 72-hour directive, written not in protest, but in principle. Either foreign operators agree to Burkina Faso's terms within 3 days, or the gates close. 2 clocks began ticking, one backed by global banks, the other by the will of a young nation. What followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. Trucks idled, terminals paused, security teams moved. It wasn't a standoff. It was a test of systems, of sovereignty, of survival. What happens when a land that's been told what to do finally says not anymore? If you've ever questioned what power really looks like in our world, not the kind on paper, but the kind that holds when pressure rises, stay with us. Because the answer won't come from speeches. It will come from what happens when the clock strikes 72. Long before the 48-hour demand ever reached Ouagadougou, the rules had already been written, just not by the people living on the land. For decades, Africa's most valuable resources didn't move under local control. They flowed through systems designed offshore, cleared through banks far from the mines, priced in currencies and never printed in Africa. Gold left, oil left, copper, lithium, manganese all left. What stayed was the poverty. What lingered was the dependence. Burkina Faso, like many others, played by the rules set in Washington, Paris, London. Not always willingly, but often without real choice. The global trade lanes, the financial clearinghouses, the contract templates, all of it favored those who arrived late but left with more. Even the payment systems told a story. Whether it was SWIFT for wire transfers or IMF loan conditions buried in legal jargon, the signals were clear: compliance earned access. Resistance brought silence. Then something shifted. In 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traore came to power in a time of upheaval. He was young, direct, and different. Instead of visiting international lenders, he visited villages. Instead of drafting 5-year plans, he fixed roads. The message was quiet but firm. Burkina Faso would no longer trade its resources for promises. By 2024, military alliances were shifting. Burkina Faso exited the ECOWAS bloc, forming a new union with Mali and Niger, the alliance of Sahel states. Regional trade began experimenting with local currency settlements. National gold reserves were moved under government oversight. Mining permits were reevaluated, and for the first time, drones and software teams based in-country began monitoring extraction sites, not foreign firms. This wasn't about isolation. It was about integrity. So when a foreign demand arrived requesting a majority share of natural wealth under threat of financial cutoff, it didn't hit a void. It hit a government that had already started building a backup plan. A 72-hour countermeasure wasn't just bold, it was structured. Permits could be suspended, servers could be moved, exports could be paused. The tools were ready. The decision had been made. Burkina Faso was not walking away from the world. It was simply walking on its own feet. At 6:00 a.m., the order was live. There was no speech, no parade, just 5 clear directives signed by the president of Burkina Faso and delivered in sealed envelopes across the country. Freeze all mineral exports audit. Every foreign-operated mine, replace private security teams with national personnel, transfer control of site data to state servers, and reroute all financial reporting through Ouagadougou. The message was not hostile, but it was final. Across the mining corridors of the country, operators read the same lines. There would be no extensions, no exemptions, no backdoor deals. What began as policy was now enforcement. At one site, a foreign IT manager refused to hand over encryption keys. A government officer quietly placed a suspension order on his desk. Credentials were revoked. Backups were rerouted to a secure data node in the capital. The transition took under 2 hours. At another location, drones swept overhead. They logged stockpile volumes, compared them to old manifests and grounded trucks that didn't match the new reporting format. One convoy tried to move under dusk. It was stopped, inspected, and turned back under escort. No arrests, just redirection. A different kind of control. By midday, the capital's command center lit up with updates. 2 operators signed the new agreements. One requested more time. Another threatened to exit the country. Burkina Faso did not retaliate. They did not seize equipment. They did not deny safe exit. But the law was changing now, not later. By evening, the 72-hour order had become more than a line in a file. It was a living system measured in drones, checklists, ID tags, and live maps. Across villages, radios played public updates. Markets buzzed with hourly reports. People didn't panic. They prepared. But not everyone adapted. At a fuel depot outside Kaya, flames broke the silence. It was contained within minutes, but investigators confirmed sabotage. 2 officials inside the Ministry of Trade were removed after transfers traced back to accounts tied to foreign contractors. Quiet moves, but significant ones. The system was under pressure, and it was responding. Across checkpoints, delays grew. Paperwork from old contracts clashed with the new rules. But while some froze, others moved fast. Village elders opened direct comms with the control center. Young engineers repurposed commercial drones into surveillance nets. Overnight, the gaps in enforcement began to close. At hour 20, the command map showed a new rhythm. Green markers for compliance, yellow for review, red for resistance. The red zones shrank, not because the threats faded, but because coordination increased. Still, one clock ticked louder in the background, the 48-hour deadline from Washington. Hour 32. A jolt. Test transactions routed through New York were denied, not delayed, blocked. The first visible strike from the foreign demand. Bank staff in Ouagadougou confirmed it. The pipeline of cash was narrowing, and now companies facing legal uncertainty inside Burkina Faso were also facing a liquidity crisis outside it. The tension wasn't just political. It was mathematical. No revenue meant no wages. No payments meant no supplies. This was the pressure point the ultimatum was designed for. Inside the capital's financial circle, there was no panic, but there was movement. Traore called for backup measures already mapped months earlier. Convert strategic reserves into regional gold swaps process, urgent trades through Mali and Niger banks, and offer local miners wage credits backed by physical assets rather than foreign wires. No one celebrated, but the breathing room mattered. Meanwhile, foreign headlines declared chaos. Analysts predicted currency collapse. Some companies halted operations, betting that the 48-hour cutoff would break the state before the 72-hour order could settle. But the people didn't flinch. In mining towns, supervisors distributed the first gold-backed pay slips. In border markets, shipments rerouted through Sahel. Partners began to arrive grain fuel medicine. Not perfect, not fast, but visible. Still whispers continued. Sabotage at a substation. Arrests made. Ties uncovered. Hour 45. Another foreign operator filed to exit. A mid-tier firm requested arbitration. The pressure was working, but not just in one direction. Inside the control room, President Traore faced the next choice. Should they offer leeway to hold on to the companies hesitating or let them go? His reply was clear. This is not about keeping everyone. It's about standing for something. If they cannot operate under our laws, they cannot operate here. The response was broadcast that night across the nation, across the region, and across timelines, flooded with updates from the confrontation. By hour 48, the foreign demand had taken effect. The arteries of international finance constricted. Payments stalled. But inside Burkina Faso, a different heartbeat held. The battle wasn't over, but neither side had broken. Not yet. By the 50th hour, no one doubted what was happening. It wasn't just a standoff between Burkina Faso and foreign companies. It was a collision between two operating systems, one built on control, the other on principle. And the truth was now impossible to ignore. When the first financial test transfers were blocked, it exposed something few ordinary citizens had ever seen up close: the world's payment systems. Swift Chip's offshore clearinghouses were not passive tools. They were levers of influence, designed to be fast when you're compliant and frozen when you're not. To the outside world, it looked like a technical issue. But inside Burkina Faso, it felt like a curtain had been pulled back. The 48-hour cutoff wasn't just policy, it was muscle. A way to remind smaller nations that the real cost of independence isn't war, but economic suffocation. No bombs, no invasions, just locked accounts and silent banks. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of cracking under the pressure, Burkina Faso began to adapt visibly publicly, hour by hour. Domestic banks, often overlooked, became lifelines. With regional coordination, small payments resumed in CFA francs and in gold-backed credits. Barter deals, long dismissed as outdated, began moving fuel and grain across the Sahel. Engineers tested peer-to-peer systems for basic transactions. It wasn't smooth, but it worked. And through it all, the people watched. They listened to radios broadcasting updates from the control room. They read bulletins posted at market entrances. They shared information, and in some cases, food. The stress was real, but so was the shift. For the first time in living memory, the system that claimed to be neutral, the global financial architecture, was behaving like a player, not a referee. And for many, it felt personal. Shopkeepers raised prices, yes. Fuel lines grew. But when rumors spread that the cuts came not from local failures, but from external blocks, the mood changed. This wasn't about rejecting the dollar. It was about asking who decides if your money moves. Who controls access to the very lifeblood of trade? By the 55th hour, one of the largest foreign mining consortiums publicly suspended operations. Their reason: payment complications due to unforeseen international restrictions. In plain terms, their wires stopped working. Foreign headlines called it a collapse. But inside Burkina Faso, another word gained ground clarity. The people could now see the full mechanism of economic influence, not in theory, but in motion. At a press meeting, a journalist asked, "Mr. President, isn't this too costly?" Traore's response was simple: "So is surrender." It wasn't bravado. It was a reminder. For decades, nations like his had signed contracts under pressure, had accepted loans with clauses they couldn't read, had watched their minerals leave only to wait months for revenue that returned through guarded gateways. Now the country had seen the system act when its control was questioned. This wasn't about Burkina Faso alone. It was about precedent, about what message would echo across the continent. That's why the sabotage attempts mattered so much, not just because of the damage, but because they exposed another layer of the story. At hour 57, 2 men were arrested near a key electrical substation. The investigation revealed links to a contractor previously flagged for violations, and with ties to a firm named in the original 48-hour dispute. It wasn't proof of conspiracy, but it was evidence that disruption wasn't only external. Someone wanted the transition to fail, not by debate, but by interruption. Still, the order held. Miners guarded equipment. Villagers coordinated watches. Engineers monitored systems through a makeshift command grid stitched together with recycled tech and open-source tools. None of it was high budget, but it was high trust, and that's what many foreign observers missed. They expected Burkina Faso to fold because they expected its people to panic. But the country didn't operate like a company. It operated like a community. The 72-hour order had done more than redirect policy. It had revealed who really believed in the state, not just as a government, but as a home. Then came the moment no one predicted. Hour 60. As analysts warned of default and markets speculated against the CFA, a new statement appeared. Not from Ouagadougou, but from Niamey, signed jointly by Mali and Niger. It announced a regional guarantee if Burkina Faso's dollar channels remained blocked. The Sahel Alliance would provide trade settlement logistics and emergency stock through shared infrastructure. It wasn't a bailout. It was a signal. The 72-hour order was no longer a solo risk. It was now a shared position. And with that, the power map began to tilt. The 48-hour demand from Washington had aimed to isolate, but by acting so aggressively, it had done the opposite. It pushed a region to close ranks. Cameras captured the first grain convoys crossing the border. Villagers waved flags. No one needed speeches. In silence, a different kind of victory took shape. By hour 60, the streets of Ouagadougou weren't quiet, but they weren't chaotic either. People still lined up for fuel, but they waited in order. Shops raised prices, but most kept their doors open. Radios buzzed in every district, not with panic, but with questions. How will we make it? Has the worst passed? What happens next? The 48-hour deadline had passed. The financial cutoff was real. Transfers were frozen. Revenue streams were interrupted. But Burkina Faso had not collapsed. It had absorbed the shock and begun to shift under its own weight. And now the weight of that shift was being felt everywhere. Inside the presidential compound, reports arrived by the hour. 2 more foreign operators had suspended operations indefinitely. Others filed complaints with international mediators. One global headline read, "Burkina Faso's gamble backfires." But in mining towns, the story was different. The first emergency wage slips backed not by bank wires, but by gold reserves had been distributed. Some called them crude. Others called them historic. Either way, they worked. Miners could feed their families. Shops accepted them. Confidence didn't surge, but it didn't vanish either. It was a narrow, difficult survival, but survival nonetheless. Outside the capital, armored patrols had been deployed to strategic depots, not to intimidate, but to protect. A second attempt at sabotage had been intercepted near a communication relay point. 2 individuals arrested, their affiliations under investigation. Across radio channels, a phrase began to surface. Sabotage is not invisible, and it is not untouchable. That message mattered, because this confrontation was no longer only economic. It was psychological. A test of patience, memory, and resolve, and, above all, trust. Villages began organizing around local grain stockpiles. Volunteer watch teams helped secure fuel depots overnight. Community leaders opened daily briefings with elders and youth groups. It wasn't official policy, it was cultural instinct. The sense that what was under attack wasn't just gold or oil, but dignity. In the region, ripple effects began to surface. In Bamako and Niamey, the images of Sahel convoys crossing into Burkina Faso trucks, filled with medicine and fuel, were broadcast live. It wasn't charity, it was coordination. Mali and Niger weren't rescuing a neighbor. They were standing with a partner. That changed the framing. What had started as an isolated standoff between Burkina Faso and a powerful external entity was now a regional declaration. If one of us is pressured, all of us feel it, and we will move together. Meanwhile, foreign observers recalculated. Sanctions were designed to isolate, to create enough discomfort that political pressure builds from within. But in this case, something different was happening. Instead of internal opposition rising against the government, there was a visible, reluctant cohesion. Not because everyone agreed, but because everyone understood what was at stake. The state wasn't just asserting control. It was asking the public to believe that control was possible. By hour 66, that belief had not yet turned into celebration, but it had rooted itself. A grain merchant in Kaya was asked by a journalist whether business was better or worse. His answer, "It's harder. But it feels like we're finally working for ourselves." That sentiment echoed. In schools, teachers used the situation as a live lesson on economics and independence. In marketplaces, children played games imitating border guards and drone pilots. In churches and mosques, prayers shifted from fear to clarity. It was no longer just a 72-hour policy window. It had become a psychological crossing point from dependency to determination. And yet, the pressure remained. Traders continued to speculate against the CFA. Foreign contracts hung in legal limbo. International media questioned whether the Sahel alliance had the depth to sustain such resistance. Warnings of inflation persisted. But inside Burkina Faso, the focus wasn't on fear, it was on fortifying. The convoy routes were reinforced, alternate trade maps drawn, new communication lines tested across rural regions. And in the control room, the lights still blinked red, yellow, and green, but the red zones were fading. The consequences of the 48-hour ultimatum were real, but so were the consequences of resisting it. And now the world was watching not just a financial response, but a national recalibration. When the clock stopped ticking at hour 72, the headlines declared a surprise Burkina Faso did not fall. But for those paying attention, the real surprise was this: the country had never intended to play the game it was being punished for refusing. And that's the shift. This wasn't about rebellion. It was about redefinition. For decades, economic power in Africa has moved in one direction out. Resources flowed north. Revenue flowed offshore and decisions were made in boardrooms an ocean away. But now something different has begun to form, not a revolution, but a recalibration. Let's be clear, this is not anti-West, it is pro-balance. Burkina Faso did not ask to be cut off. It asked to operate under rules it could shape. The 72-hour directive wasn't a rejection of global engagement. It was a request for terms based on mutual respect, not inherited leverage. That's what makes this moment so strategic. In the language of geopolitics, nations often act alone when they feel isolated, but they form alliances when they see possibility. That's what the Sahel states understood. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso didn't simply reject outside pressure. They began constructing something in its place, and not just with statements. They rerouted shipments. They tested alternative payment rails. They backed each other with real assets, grain fuel transport corridors. When one artery was blocked, they opened another. Not fast, not perfect, but functional. This was not a grand economic miracle. It was a working prototype. And for other African nations watching Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, Senegal, that prototype matters. Because here's the deeper truth: sovereignty is not declared, it's tested. And often those tests come quietly through contracts, through banks, through silence, when the terms no longer make sense. The Burkina Faso example didn't just challenge a single policy, it exposed a pattern. Too many African states have built budgets on exports they do not control through currencies they do not issue enforced by contracts they cannot rewrite. And when pressure comes, they are told the same thing: adapt or be excluded. But what happens when exclusion doesn't lead to collapse, but cooperation? What happens when three nations stand together not to attack, but to shield? This is not nostalgia for non-alignment. It is a new strategy built in the shadow of that old alignment, but grounded in today's tools. It uses drones instead of debt. It codes local software instead of importing foreign metrics. It looks not for confrontation, but for coordination. Critics may argue the risks are too high, and they're not wrong. Burkina Faso's decision carries economic weight. Foreign investors may pause, supply chains may stretch, credit ratings may dip. But those are the visible costs. The invisible costs of remaining dependent, of never building alternatives, of losing control quietly over time, are harder to measure, but just as real. And in this story, we see that clearly. Every hour after the 48-hour cutoff, that Burkina Faso stayed standing, sent a message